we'll start recording, or I guess it's being recorded now, but we'll at the hour, we'll start promptly and then try to finish up roughly on time.
Yeah.
And there is a smaller group that's gonna after this, they'll be divided into there's a subset of people who've cooked up their specific aims, and there's a separate Zoom link that mentors and mentees will enter. So, but
And should I go to that part?
if you're interested in checking it out, you're more than welcome to. It's basically going to be 7 subgroups in a Zoom room.
Yeah.
If you had time to kind of poke around and check it out and observe, that's great. But I mean, you're in Vietnam and you're
I'm
it's
actually
totally up to you.
pretty exhausted, so I'll if I just mostly wanted to check that I wasn't expected to be there.
No, not expected. And we'll share the report with you afterwards.
Yeah, that'll be great.
So I'm going to go ahead and launch in. Thank you everyone for joining us today. We have a real amazing guest, Professor Bill Miller. He's at the Ohio State University in the Division of Epidemiology. Dr. Miller has talked about grant writing. I saw him talk in China. I know a couple of months ago he was doing the same or similar series in Malawi. He's really an expert on thinking about grant writing, but not just thinking about it, doing it. He's a really accomplished grant writer and scientist, and we're thrilled to have him with us today to kick off this series. Just a few housekeeping measures. You'll notice this is a webinar series, so if you have questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A section. There should also be a little bit of room at the end for additional questions. And if you have any questions about the Grant-o-thon more generally, there is the website. We'll put the link to the Grant-o-thon website and the notes on writing research grants that Dr. Miller shared a useful PDF that will also be on the website. So without further ado, over to you, Dr. Miller. Thanks again.
Thanks, Joe. Appreciate it. And as Joe said, I've been teaching grant writing for probably 20 years now, in various forms to various groups of people. And it's a pleasure to be here to do that today. Boy, am I not advancing. Come on now. There we go. So just a brief note about terminology. So the U.S. National Institutes of Health uses the term specific aims. Other agencies may refer to things like research objectives or research goals or something similar. But regardless of what terms are used, the principles are really the same. I'm going to use the term aims or specific aims interchangeably. And when I use those terms, what I'm really talking about is the first page of a grant proposal. That's basically an introduction and then the statements of what you're going to do. And I'm also going to refer to aims statements. These refer to the one-sentence descriptions of the proposed research, and they usually begin something like to describe or to assess or something like that. Before you start working on your aims, you really have to have a very clear research question. And that research question must be interesting. And first of all, it has to be interesting to you, because if it's not interesting to you, then it's going to be very difficult to write. And especially it's going to be very difficult to write a full grant proposal. And it has to be interesting to the scientific community, because if it's not interesting to other people, no one is going to provide you with funding to do what you think is an interesting research question. It also has to be focused, and it has to be feasible. And I'm going to talk more about those aspects in just a moment. So there are various ways to refine your research question or put them into a framework, and I've included two here, which work quite well and are in many ways complementary to one another. Both of them are acronyms, so you can refer to the FINER framework. And the FINER framework means that the research question should be feasible, interesting, novel, ethical, and relevant. So whenever we talk about feasibility, that means that the what you're proposing to do has to match the amount of funding available. And it's quite common to have bigger ideas than what the funding would allow you to do. And again, interesting means interesting to you, but also interesting to the scientific community. Novel implies that there has to be something that it's bringing into the world of science. What is important, and what is your research question going to add to what's known? Ethical means that it just what it says. It has to be an ethical thing to do. And relevant means, in a sense, it has to have some significance. People have to care about what you want to do. The second framework is the PICOT framework, and that is one that really helps you sort of think about the elements of your research question. So PICOT, we have population, meaning who are you going to be studying? Intervention, if there is an intervention, it means what you will be doing to that population. If it's more of an epidemiological study, it's sometimes referred to as the factor of interest. Then we have what groups are going to be compared within your population. The outcomes, meaning what are you going to measure at the end of the study to be able to say that you had an effect, and then what time frame are you looking at? I'm going to check the Q&A here real quick, and I'm going to answer it, even though Joe's typing an answer, and say yes, you will have access to the handout from this talk. So whenever you're developing a research proposal, the specific aims is by far and away the most important page of that whole proposal. And so you will spend, or you should spend, a lot of time developing the specific aims page. When I was at UNC and I taught a grant writing course, it was a 2-semester course, which means that it met for about 8 months. And over those 8 months, the students would write a grant proposal. And we spent the first 4 months on just this one page, the specific aims page. And then the second 4 months, they developed the rest of the grant proposal. And the reason for that is because you have to have your aims very clear, very precise, and that will lead to a clear proposal. Another really important aspect is that when reviewers read a grant proposal, a large proportion of their impression of your idea comes from the aims page. And that's because it's the first thing that they will read, and in many grant review committees, like at the US NIH, it may be the only thing that the majority of the committee looks at. So at NIH, you would have 3 reviewers. They would read the whole grant proposal. The rest of the 20 or 30 member committee would only be looking at the aims very quickly. The basic elements of the specific aims are something that looks like this. You'll have introductory paragraphs, usually 2 to 4 of them. Some aims statements of what you're going to do. By far and away, it's most common to have 3 aims statements, but that is not a requirement. You just don't want to have too many. More than 4 would generally be too many.
You'll have a brief overview of how the study will be done. That can be done either aim by aim or in one overview. And you'll have some form of a wrap-up statement that describes the impact of what you're planning to do. So it will, the aims page will address the why, the what, the who, and the how, as well as the where of what you're proposing to do. There are lots of guides and instructions about how to write an aims page or how to write a grant or more generally. The thing I want to stress is that there's not really one formula for a grant. And that's important to remember because some grants will fit a formula really well and others won't. So the only formula that really matters is the formula that works to convey the information clearly to the reader. So here are some examples of different ways you could structure an aims page depending on the content of your proposal. So in option one, we start with that same introduction of 2 or 3 paragraphs. We finish with with general objectives, and then we move on to describe the aims by one hypothesis at a time, and repeat that for aims 2 and 3, and finish with an aim statement. In option 2, we have an introduction, usually 2 to 3 paragraphs, and that introduction again is followed by a general objectives description, and within that general description is something we call a central hypothesis, which is an overarching hypothesis of your entire planned research. Then you might give an overview of what you're planning to do, state your 3 aims, and finish with an impact statement. And finally, option 3, which is probably the one that I use most commonly, we have an introduction, then a final paragraph, including that central or overarching hypothesis, and then a statement of aim 1, a brief overview of what will be done there, a statement of aim 2, a brief overview of what was done there, statement of aim 3, overview, and finishing again with the impact statement. So let's look at this in a little bit more depth. We have our structure of the aims with an introduction paragraphs. So that will be 1 to 3 paragraphs. In those paragraphs, we're going to introduce the topic, and we're going to sell the importance of your idea. And it's really important to remember that grant proposals are part salesmanship. You're trying to convince the reader of the importance of your work. It's a little bit different writing a grant than it is writing a paper. In a manuscript, the results of research, we tend to be a little bit understated. We're trying to describe all the potential problems and issues that we might have, and we don't overstate what we have done. But in a grant, you're really trying to sell the reader on the idea. So you want to be a little bit more like push the limit a little bit more than you might in a manuscript. And in the aims page, it's really important to make what you plan to do obvious. So it should be very clear exactly what the rest of the grant is going to tell the reviewer. So this introduction is the 2 to 3 most important paragraphs of your entire proposal. You have to convince the reader of the significance and possibly the innovation of your project, and you must make it clear and obvious what your project is about. But you only have a little bit of space, so every word is precious. So it's really important not to include any extraneous information. One of the things that's important to think about is the first sentence of every paragraph. By far and away, the most important sentence in the entire proposal is the first sentence of the aims page. That first sentence sets the stage for the rest of the document. And it should go directly to what the grant is about. It should give a very clear sense of what problem is being addressed in your proposed work. The next 2 most important sentences are the topic sentences, or the first sentences of paragraphs 2 and 3. And other important sentences will be your aim statements and your hypotheses. Beyond those 5 or 6 sentences, everything else is pretty much filling in the details of what you plan to do. You can consider the introduction to the aims as a funnel. So think of the 3 intro paragraphs as beginning very broadly and then narrowing down to your plan. So the first paragraph is a statement of the public health problem, why it's important. The second paragraph will be describing the gap in the knowledge about the problem that you're working on. And the third paragraph will be what you are going to do about that problem. So in paragraph 1, that global statement of the problem, it's really important to state clearly why your area of study is important. I had one student call it one time the paragraph to scare the reader by showing how bad the disease is. And that can be particularly important when you're working with a disease or a problem that is less common or less prevalent. You might have to educate the reader about how significant your issue is. And then in this paragraph, make sure all the information that is included is directly relevant to what you're proposing. The second paragraph is the knowledge gap. And in addressing the knowledge gap, it allows you to bring in the specific area that you're planning to do research more directly. Address what is known and what isn't known explicitly. And I'll encourage you to do this by writing about what we understand, what we know, that sort of thing, as opposed to what the literature says or what the literature doesn't say. Really focus on the science as opposed to the literature. Sometimes this paragraph will help address the intervention that you're planning, if there is an intervention involved, sort of describing what intervention is needed. And in general, this paragraph will be more focused than the first paragraph. And again, no extraneous information, nothing that doesn't help you build the case for what you're planning to do. So sometimes paragraph 2 may actually be 2 or even 3 paragraphs. Essentially use the space to make the case for what you're proposing to do. But keep in mind that space is precious and every word must be needed. And later on, you're going to need some space to be able to describe exactly briefly what work you are proposing to do. So the final paragraph will be a brief statement of what you're planning to do. It may include something about why your team is the best team for the project. If there's been a central hypothesis, this is where it would be described. And remember, no extraneous information or words. Keep everything right to the point. So I'm going to spend a couple minutes going through an example aims page of a funded project. I'm going to present it paragraph by paragraph. And I'm going to read it aloud just to give you a sense of how we go from that broad to narrow and then describing the plan. So I'm not going to say anything about what this project is. I'm just going to go ahead and read it and allow yourselves to see where we're, hopefully by the end, you will have a very good sense of what this project is about. So in Asia, the HIV epidemic has shifted from people who inject drugs to men who have sex with men. In 2021, MSM comprised 43% of new cases in Vietnam. This shift is multifactorial, including low pre-exposure prophylaxis uptake and persistence. In Hanoi, about 50% of MSM stopped PrEP within 6 months. So just from that paragraph, without much any more detail, you have the sense that we're talking about HIV among MSM in Vietnam, and that it's going to involve PrEP and its uptake and persistence. Moving on to the second paragraph. This epidemic shift is also driven by alcohol use, which affects MSM's behavioral decisions and PrEP use. Heavy alcohol use is normative in Vietnam. Men often feel pressure to drink and drink to excess. MSM often report unhealthy alcohol use, defined as a spectrum of use from risky, hazardous, to alcohol use disorder. In Hanoi, 63% of MSM attending a sexual health clinic reported unhealthy alcohol use. Unhealthy alcohol use brings consequences affecting every step of the HIV prevention and care cascade, including reduced PrEP persistence and adherence. Despite these negative impacts of unhealthy alcohol use, alcohol reduction interventions for MSM are rare. So in this paragraph, we've moved from showing that we need to do something about MSM and preventing HIV to talking about a specific issue related to alcohol use and excessive alcohol use, and highlighting that there are relatively few interventions designed for this purpose. At the top there is just finishing the previous paragraph. So now we have the third paragraph. One promising strategy to prevent HIV among MSM is the brief alcohol intervention, which is based on cognitive behavioral therapy and motivational enhancement therapy. In our RCT, READART, we showed that BAI, comprising 2 individual face-to-face sessions and 2 booster sessions, increased viral suppression among Vietnamese people with HIV with unhealthy alcohol use. PWH on ART with concomitant unhealthy alcohol use received either the BAI or standard of care. Viral suppression at 12 months was 92% compared to 77%. This effect was mediated through reduced alcohol use and increased ART adherence. The BAI was cost-effective, and participants found the BAI components clinically and culturally acceptable. So here we've talked about a specific intervention which was used for a different purpose, which was among people with HIV to improve their HIV outcomes. And we are sort of hinting at that this is going to be a useful tool for PrEP as well. So continuing on to the last paragraph here, or the next to last paragraph, extending the use of the BAI from ART to PrEP for HIV prevention is a logical step. Effective PrEP use requires persistence in care and adherence to the prescribed regimen, whether daily, oral, event-driven, or injectable. For many MSM, risk behaviors vary over time. If risk decreases, a switch to event-driven prep or prep discontinuation may be appropriate. We refer to matching of current risk to prep use as risk-aligned prep use, also known as prevention effective adherence. Persistence, adherence, and risk-aligned prep use may all be affected by unhealthy alcohol use. Offering the BAI to MSM with unhealthy alcohol use at the time of prep initiation could improve prep outcomes through a mechanism similar to that seen in REDART, reduced alcohol use and improved medication adherence. So now we've set up the whole thing. We started off with MSM and their increased risk in Vietnam over the last few years, identified the need for a alcohol reduction intervention, proposed one that has worked well in another context, and then brought it to the prep context. So finally, we finished the aims by stating we propose an effectiveness implementation type 1 hybrid randomized controlled trial to compare the BAI to standard of care among MSM with unhealthy alcohol use who are initiating or reinitiating oral event-driven or injectable PrEP in Vietnam. We hypothesize that the BAI will improve PrEP persistence, PrEP adherence, and risk-aligned PrEP use. This type 1 hybrid ensures rapid scale-up if the RCT is successful, and our specific aims are to, and then we would go on to provide the aim statements. So from that introduction, you have a very good idea of what we're doing and why we're doing it. And I'm happy to say this trial just recently started in the last couple of weeks. So when you've written your introduction, one of the ways to sort of test whether you have the information that you need there is to do something I refer to as the paper test, which is let someone read your aims, but cover over the actual statements of the aims page. So a reviewer should be able to tell you pretty clearly what you are going to do without looking at the actual aim statements. So you want the reader to be able to anticipate what you're planning to do. You never want to surprise them when they get to the bottom of the page. I know there are a couple of questions and hands raised, but I'm going to take questions at the end rather than in the middle. The structure of your aim statements is really important. So you want them to be clear and concise and complete. And remember that it's really easy to feel like your aims are clear when they're not, or that they're specific when they're not. So in the aim statements, try to use active verbs to describe what you're going to do. So verbs like compare and measure and describe, adapt, evaluate. For myself, I feel that it's fine to use words like explore if an aim is truly exploratory. Some people like to try to avoid that because that implies that it's not driven by a hypothesis. But often what you are doing is exploring, and that's okay. Aims that are too dependent on one another can be a problem. So what I mean by that is if aim 3 is dependent on the success of aim 2, you cannot proceed with the subsequent aim. So in other words, you should be able to do aim 3 in some way, even if aim 2 is unsuccessful. The scope of the project, as reflected in the aim statements, has to match the funding available in the type of grant mechanism. So, grants range from very small, a few $100s, to massive, like millions of dollars. So making sure that the scope matches that funding is important. And most commonly what happens is a relatively small amount of funding, people are trying to do too much. So an award that is focused on developing on project development should really focus on developing an intervention or something like that that will conclude with a pilot study. And it's the development that is important here, or it's focused on collecting preliminary studies. A larger award must involve a trial or observational study of substantial size, or basic science work that is significant. And then a career development award like NIH K-43 has to involve appropriate training and related research activities. So those career development awards have both training elements and research within them. So here are some example aim statements from a different grant. This is a implementation science grant where we're taking a evidence-based intervention, which was systems navigation and psychosocial counseling, hence the name SNAP, from a trial up to scale in multiple test sites. So the three aims are shown here. The first one is to compare standard implementation mapping to tailored implementation mapping to scale up SNAP and HIV test sites in Vietnam. The second aim is to measure the incremental costs of IM versus TIM for SNAP implementation in Vietnam. And the third is to explore the key characteristics of high and low performing HIV test sites. In contrast, this is another study which is more of a intervention development study. So here an intervention is being taken and adapted to Vietnam. So adapt the proven friendship bench protocol to be optimized for people living with HIV in Vietnam. And then a pilot study is being done to evaluate the feasibility, fidelity, and acceptability of the adapted friendship bench, as well as preliminary indicators of its impact in improving CMDs and HIV care and drug use treatment outcomes. And finally, for a career development award, the aims might look something like this: to assess the mental health needs of WWUM women who use methamphetamine in Haiphong province, to adapt the friendship bench to the specific needs of Vietnamese women who use methamphetamine, and to assess the feasibility, fidelity, and acceptability of the adapted friendship bench for common mental disorders among WWUM, and preliminary indicators of its impact in improving CMDs, meth use, HIV risk behaviors, and PrEP and ART in a 2-arm randomized trial. So generally speaking, work that is hypothesis-driven will be viewed as stronger, and hypotheses can either be specific to each aim, or they can be global and a central hypothesis, as we stated earlier. So central hypotheses are typically given in the last paragraph before the aims, and it covers the overall goal of the study. In other words, a guiding hypothesis that will be addressed by completing all of the aims of the study. So here's the central hypothesis for SNAP, the study I gave you the aims for a couple minutes ago. We hypothesized that compared to standard intervention mapping, tailored intervention mapping will increase site fidelity to SNAP, increase PWID ART uptake, and be cost effective. When you use aim by aim hypotheses, they are given after each aim. They're typically set off on a new line with hypothesis. You usually don't have more than 2 for each aim, usually just 1. And if you can't specify a hypothesis for each aim, it's often better to have a central hypothesis. So rather than having like 2 aims with a hypothesis, and no hypothesis for aim 3, go ahead and just make a central one that covers the entire project. Each of these aim by aim hypotheses should be directly testable with your analytical methods. And that's really important. It doesn't make any sense when you're doing a hypothesis for an aim to give an aim that can't be directly tested. Finally, you'll have some description of what you're going to do in an overview. And it's really helpful to do this description to give the reader a sense of what your design of your study actually is. So this can be included with each aim, or as a part of the last paragraph of the introduction, or after the aim statements altogether. Most commonly, I tend to do it with each aim, and there's a brief description of the study design, intervention, and outcomes. So here's the example from SNAP for aim 1, and you'll see we will conduct a 2-arm pragmatic cluster randomized implementation trial among HIV test sites in Vietnam. We talk about them being randomized. We give information about the 2 arms, what's in them, and then we describe the primary outcomes, both implementation outcomes and effectiveness outcomes, and when it's going to be measured. So if you were to line this up with the PCOT, which I showed in the second slide or so, you can pretty clearly identify the population, what the intervention is, the timing, all of the elements of the PCOT. So once you've gotten through all of that for your specific aims, you're going to finish up with an impact statement, which is a paragraph that highlights the overall impact of your proposed work. It's really trying to address the question of what will the world gain by funding this proposal. And so be specific here and don't overpromise what you're going to accomplish. So here's the example from SNAP. In HPTN 074, our team successfully implemented and evaluated SNAP, one of the most promising EBI for PWID to date. Our experienced team is perfectly positioned. We go on to talk about how this will guide the ministries of health, how should provide a cost-efficient approach to implementation, and it will help improve the health of people who use drugs with HIV in resource-limited settings. So it's really just setting the stage for describing how important this work might be. So when are your aims done? Well, the complete answer is when everything that we've just talked about is really taken care of. But they should address these questions. Why is the topic important? How is this going to advance our knowledge about this particular topic? What's the gap that's going to be addressed? What are you going to do? Where will you do it, and how will you do it? So that you have a sense for all of the elements of the proposed project. And the single most important part of any grant is this specific aims page. So even when the grant mechanism uses a different name, such as objectives, it's really the same principles here. You just have to adapt it to the specific constraints of that funding organization. Keep in mind that space is limited and every word must be chosen carefully. Every word has to do its job. So tell the story of your work, of why your work is important in that introduction, and make that very, very compelling. Be sure to give enough information that the reader can judge the feasibility and the potential value of the proposed work. You have to give enough information about what you're planning to do so that the reader can really assess, is this possible or not? Because if they think it's it's not possible, they won't opt to fund it. And our goal here is to help you get funded. So thank you very much. I'm going to turn and look at the questions here. Yes, so the first question is, can you please throw more light when you say focus on the science and not the literature in paragraph 2 of the AIM statement page? So what I mean by that is that many of us, when we're writing, have a tendency to write about papers. In other words, we'll write, that Tucker et al. Showed such and such. Or we write, previous research has shown that such and such. Well, in reality, those extra words there, like Tucker et al. Has shown that, are completely unnecessary. What you actually need is the rest of the sentence. So maybe the rest of the sentence shows that crowdsourcing is a really useful tool for adapting an intervention to a specific population. By bringing in the Tucker et al. Part, you're actually sort of distracting from the main message, which is that crowdsourcing really works for this purpose. So focus on what we know and what we don't know, and not on who did it or that it had been done in some paper somewhere. Just focus on what is known and what isn't. The second question here in the Q&A is, greetings, do descriptive studies need hypotheses? And do descriptive studies require attrition calculations? So descriptive studies, as long as you're clear that you're doing a descriptive study, do not need hypotheses. By definition, in a way, a descriptive study is describing the state of a population, or describing simply what happens to a group over time. Now, if you're including work over time, you're most very likely to be tempted to move beyond description. So just be aware of that. And secondly, if you're looking over time, you probably will need some information about how many people are going to be lost to follow-up, no matter what kind of study you do. But to answer the first part, if it's truly description, there's not really a need for a hypothesis. And I think that's all the questions. Oh, no, we have a couple more. All right. So it asks, for the purpose of clarity for the younger applicants, could you kindly mention the difference between general aim, general objective, aims, and objectives? So so a general aim or general objective, I'm not going to distinguish between aim and objective, because for the most part, I don't distinguish between those. I know that some people do make a distinction between those. To me, they're synonyms. But a general aim or objective is sort of describing your whole purpose, and it may even be the whole purpose of your research enterprise. Whereas the specific aims and objectives are very focused on this particular study. And when you focus on the specific aims for what you're trying to do, the more specific they are, the better. So as an example, you might have a general objective of sort of considering the way that we can engage populations to help develop interventions for themselves. And your goal is to engage them effectively, but your specific aim might be within a particular population of MSM. You're going to engage people through social media to be able to develop an intervention to increase HIV testing. Those are quite different statements. The next question how can one get the NIH review criteria as a guide for synthesis in the significance section? Well, there's, if I'm understanding the question for sure, if you go to the NIH website, there's lots of guidance for writing grants, and in addition, every description of a grant type will have very explicit criteria for what's expected in different sections. They won't be maybe as detailed as you would like because there's so much different kinds of science. But really, if you think about it in terms of the significance, if you think very straightforwardly about what is it that people need to know about this topic for them to understand why it's important, that will guide your significance section.
Thanks, Bill. This was great. Really fascinating. I feel like it's so the aims are just something that I go back to and back to and back to and sort of iteratively refine. And even after reviewing so many grants, having your watching your presentation was helpful, and definitely things that I think are important moving forward. Yeah, thanks so much. This was great.
Yep. Thanks very much, Joe. Thanks,
Any
everyone.
There will be a recording, as Yusha mentioned. It'll be online, and I think, Bill, you said it's okay to post the slides online too. Is that right?
Yep, absolutely. I'll share. I changed a couple things, so I'll share these and make sure they have a opportunity to take them down.
Perfect. Thanks so much.
Yep.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good day. Bye-bye. Anything else, Yusha?
Yeah, I don't have any other things to announce. Maybe for the next section, we will have our Professor Juliet to give you some introduction about how to write the innovation part of the specific aims. So yeah, that's all. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.